Hi, this is episode 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals podcast, and today we're going to focus on goals relating to equity. So, under this episode, we have the goals of no poverty, quality education, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, reduced inequalities, and peace, justice, and strong institutions. So, let's begin with no poverty. So, the main goal of this sustainable development goal is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. So essentially, some of the work that the UN had done against poverty, a lot of it was erased by COVID-19, and that's sort of a theme throughout this podcast, is that a lot of work done towards helping these goals has been regressed by COVID-19. So inflation and the war in Ukraine are also contributing to rising poverty, and the working poverty rate rose for the first time in 2 decades today. So, only 1% of the unemployed in developing countries receive cash benefits, while over 50% do in developed countries. So let's look at some ways of reducing poverty. One of the ways is gender equality and equity, which can be like paying women for their work and increasing like female contribution in the workforce, building infrastructure in underdeveloped communities, such as preparing for natural disasters and conflicts, committing to climate change because natural disasters lead to poverty, or committing to ending climate change. And then ending hunger and thirst and just better healthcare in general, and distributing money. So most wealth is concentrated in the top 1% of people. If spread out, that could really help end poverty. Our second goal is quality education, and the main focus of this is ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. So 147 million children missed over half of in-person instruction due to COVID-19. So COVID-19 has further entrenched different educational inequities. So 24 million learners may never return to school. So ways of improving education, we could have lobbying policymakers to prioritize education in all countries, really. Create programs to raise money for better education, like better technology, better trained / more teachers, more schools. Work to find ways to keep students enrolled. So some students might drop out due to family issues or poverty because they might need to work. But if we work with students and we work with parents, we can find a way to keep students enrolled in school. And one benefit of COVID-19, although it's a small benefit, is that the closing of schools has allowed some countries to revamp their education systems, but there's not many. And so sort of just like we need to look at education systems as a whole in different countries and sort of see like how can we prioritize like student mental health, student learning. Our third goal is gender equality, which is something I'm very passionate about, and I'm sure Elizabeth is passionate about as well. So the main goal, or the main focus of this, is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. So on average, women only make up about 26.2% of national parliaments or similar governing bodies, and women only account for about 39% of global employment, but they account for about 45% of employment losses in 2020. So there was a loss of women from the workforce due to COVID-19. And then 25% of women over the age of 15 have been subjected to some kind of partner abuse at least once. And then there's also just a general lack of information on female and sexual health care. So the main way to improve this is definitely through educating women. Like that's like the number one way that has been shown to increase women involvement in the workforce, and it empowers women. Women that are educated are less likely to be subject to female genital mutilation and less likely to be like a child bride. They're more likely to work in a position of power in like the government. And it would also sort of require restructuring education in order to make young girls feel equal. I took a course over the summer that dealt a lot on like women and like female education and like the like inherent biases we have against women as from like a young age. And so media influence and sort of like teacher training can cause like young girls can be less interested in like higher power fields and in STEM fields particularly. And then we also just need to focus on policy changes for like more rights for women and equal rights for women than I have for men. Our fourth goal is decent work and economic growth. So the main goal of that is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth and full and productive employment and decent work for all. So the pandemic has exacerbated already existing economic inequities. So there's a higher unemployment rate, a disruption of supply chains, rising inflation, and changes in the labor market, such as loss of workforce due to the pandemic. The Ukraine crisis has also caused economic hardship. So along with that, about 1 in 10 children are engaged in some kind of child labor. So for help, we need government programs for incentives to work, such as like subsidies for working and like getting people back involved in the workforce. We could also have UN and government investment in small firms in like low developed countries, just to boost those areas of the economy. And then we also just need more bills and like laws that help boost the economy, that help people, on like personal individual levels. Our sixth and final goal for this podcast is reduce inequalities. So this sort of encompasses a lot of what we've already talked about, but the main goal is just to reduce inequalities in and among countries. So the pandemic has caused the first rise in between country income inequality in a generation. So that would mean like one country is just overall like more like rich than another country. 1 in 5 people have also experienced discrimination that is banned under the international human rights law. So how to help this would require like slow, like progressive action. Like this would not we would not be able to like suddenly like upheave all the world like overnight. This is something that requires slow action, but something that progressively gets better. We could increase the minimum wage for it to be a living wage so people can all make an income that like they can live off of, which is something that a lot of countries and even the US, which is known as like a super developed country, like struggle with. We can also work with / like force the top 1% to distribute wealth evenly among people in LDCs or least developed countries. And we could also have tax cuts for poor people. And then we also just need to enforce and like take anti-discrimination laws that protect people with like disabilities, women, religious minorities, like seriously, like it's not a joke, like you take that seriously, like, and this is sort of more of like a social like PR sort of incentive, I would say.
Yeah, also like taxing higher, like richer people, because right now there's a fair amount of tax cuts and like ways to get out of paying taxes for the like uber rich people. And so if we tax them more, then it will start providing more equity in general.
Yeah, and then I lied about this being our final one. Our final one goal for this podcast is peace, justice, and strong institutions. So the main goal of this is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So sort of just making the government, and justice systems more inclusive and less corrupt. And that's something that the UN mentions in their Sustainable Development Report of 2022, is that corruption is found like almost everywhere. And it found that like 1 in 6 companies or something like that have received some sort of like bribe from like governments. 1/4 of the global population also lives in like conflict affected areas. So this goal is also just about like establishing like worldwide peace. However, there has been a 5.2% lowering of the homicide rate from 2015 to 2020, so that's a good thing. But basically, we just need to demand peace in conflict affected areas such as like the Middle East or during the Ukraine crisis, and sort of establish new national human rights institutions and like just make sure that justice is like served and there's no like corruption or anything, that like holding governments accountable for their actions and like holding justice officials accountable for their actions.
I think like a lot of that, especially in the US, there's a lot of human rights injustices going on, as well as like basically pretty much almost every country there are like massive human rights violations, and I think holding that accountable would be a good step in the right direction. Is like just even like recognizing it as the first step. So like as Americans, we need to recognize like the social injustices and the political and the economic injustices to move forward, so that we can have those institutions here to like hold our government and different organizations accountable.
Okay. Yes, I agree totally. So we now have some discussion questions for this podcast.
So how are these equity goals linked to each other?
I would say one main thing that goes out throughout these equity goals is that they've all been sort of affected by COVID-19, not 2019, by COVID-19. I've sort of been set.
Also 2019.
Also 2019, yes, and have sort of been set back by COVID-19. So obviously, like, ending the COVID-19 pandemic could definitely help with a lot of these goals, because it's still going on and we still need to fix that, you know?
Yeah, I think another step is like recognizing that we are still in a pandemic, and just like a lot of the aid and stuff that was going out to different groups is now like ending, but we are still like, we are in a like, okay, pandemic is worldwide, but we're still like in a pandemic that is affecting everyone. And I think making sure that like people are getting vaccinated, that we are keeping our like the areas around us safe, and being informed about current like rises in COVID numbers or rises in RSV or like any of those diseases. And also like, oh gosh, like overall vaccination, like polio is back.
Yeah. And we're actually going to talk about vaccination more in our fourth episode, which is on health, because that's a main part of that episode. But I would say these equity goals are also linked to each other by, like, one way to solve them is by, like, educating people. Like, we need to put more focus on, like, educating people, because educated people are more likely to participate in the workforce, and they're more likely to develop new and innovative ways to sort of, like, one, create, like, sustainable energy, which is something we talked about in the last episode with climate change, and something we'll talk about in the next episode, which is just sustainability as a whole, and also just, like, people that are educated are less likely to let sort of like inequities happen to them. They're more outspoken. They're just like educating your people is important.
The education, like that's another thing like COVID has really hit, is like I was especially like talking to my math teacher about this, but like people who missed out on basic algebra, like who had it online, like you can't get that fully back. Like it will just take longer, and a lot of the, like later, like some teachers don't recognize that, and so you're just thrown into classes, and you're like, wait, why don't I have a basic understanding of this concept? It's because you had it online.
Yeah, exactly. Our next question is,
do these links make them easier to solve or harder to solve?
I would say definitely easier, because it's sort of like, well, when looking at, like, for example, like educating people, like that can solve a lot of these issues at the same time, but also it's sort of like in certain concepts, sort of like, and we'll deal with that more in sustainability, is that like, and health, is that increasing one area such as like agriculture, so people have more food, could actually like decrease like sustainability, such as like cutting down like trees to create more land for agriculture, which we are in like a food shortage, like worldwide. Like we have like a massive amount of people that are suffering from hunger. But at the same time, like a lot of our current ways for solving hunger are not sustainable. So that's sort of just like an example of saying like sometimes these links can make them easier and sometimes they can make them harder.
Yeah, especially like if they're big overarching concepts like equity, or like solving like systemic racism, solving like all of these systemic issues. That's like that's a massive thing to solve. And there are so many factors that intersect that like while solving one, you're just like there's so many more to look at. So, like, it's different types of progress and different ways of progressing.
Yeah. Our third question is,
how can ordinary people better plan, better push to make wide governmental change?
Yeah, I would say, obviously, calling your representatives if you live in a country that has, like, a representative government, but also just, like, protesting, making sure that you're, like, heard by the government, and like making like a literal like change in the government, saying like, hey, I'm not gonna let this happen to me, you know, like this is something that needs to be fixed. It's like about holding your governments like accountable for their actions, saying like this is wrong and you need to fix it, and not just letting it like slide off your back or whatever.
Yeah, like writing to your public officials, vote, please vote. If you're eligible to vote, you can register now. If you're going to be 18 by the next general election, you can vote in the primary. Please vote. It's very important. I know it seems like it's not super important all the time, because like a lot of the government officials don't fully listen, but it, like, if everyone our age voted,
Yeah,
it would make such a big difference.
yeah, exactly. Okay, our final question for this podcast is,
So relating back to our 17th goal, how can high developed countries work to improve inequities in LDCs?
yeah, that stands for least developed countries. So essentially it's just like high developed countries need to like help low developed countries. Like that's a simple way of saying it, is like devoting their resources, and like in super rich countries that have super rich people, sort of like saying like, hey, we need to help these countries that are struggling. You know, it's about like being fair.
Helping the other countries is very important. We also want to make sure that it's through like monetary means and not through like direct governmental, like,
Yeah,
we're in your country now and we're gonna fix it kind of thing, because that's a
No.
thing like the US has done and is not great about. So like towing the line between that is very important.
yeah, that's super important. Okay, so that's it for this episode. Thank you for listening.
Yay.